Welcome to session 4 in a teaching series on the Passion Week of Jesus Christ. A very quick announcement. Next week is, in fact, Holy Week. This Sunday is Palm Sunday in our Christian calendar. And it occurred to me that perhaps it would be helpful to some to actually walk through the week day by day, teaching each day the events of that day in the Passion Week of Jesus as recorded in Scripture. And so that is our plan. And we will go live, I trust, next Sunday on Palm Sunday, but we'll do it at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then on each successive day through Friday, Monday through Friday, we'll meet at 10 in the morning. That is, I'll go live at 10 in the morning. They will be recorded. You can access them, the lessons, anytime after that as well. And then on Resurrection Sunday, it would be appropriate, certainly, to meet then, but I don't want to conflict with church service and so on. So we will do it at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Easter Sunday. So that's the plan as God gives us strength and opens the door. I'm looking forward to it. But we have to get there, and we have to be ready for the triumphal entry for Palm Sunday. And so we need to get to the lesson that's before us. So let me take you to a PowerPoint that kind of walks us through it. And let me first of all begin with some review, because you remember that we talked about events which culminated in the triumphal entry. Now, again, the triumphal entry Sunday morning is the beginning of what we think of as the Passion Week. But there are events which really biblically set it up. And we started, and I want to recall this because it's very important to what we're going to do. So we began with this event in Jesus' life, this remarkable episode where Jesus was in Perea. This is in Luke 13. And we went through this rather carefully. Jesus had fled Jerusalem because his enemies, after he had insisted that he and the Father are one, Jesus' enemies had taken up stones to stone him. And so he had fled the jurisdiction of Pilate to the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas. And while he was there, some Pharisees came trying to trick him back into Judea, you remember, because Judea, again, ruled by Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was very, very much at the mercy of, if you don't mind, or to a considerable degree, the Jewish leadership could get him to do their bidding. Herod Antipas, on the other hand, was entirely, they had no leverage over him. And so Jesus knew that he was the more secure and less danger if he just fled or made his way from Jerusalem down to the Jordan River and across into Perea, the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas. But the Bible is explicit in John chapter 10 that many followed him there and that many were believing because of his teaching there in Perea. And this further angered his enemies, the Jewish leadership. And so they came over with a cheap trick to try and lure him back into Jerusalem, you remember? And they said, you better get out of here. Herod wants to kill you. And Jesus saw through that, but he insisted. And I think perhaps it would be helpful to actually go. Let me take you to this passage. I can do it quickly. In Luke 13, and it's verse 31. Well, actually, we won verse 34 ultimately. But Luke 31, 34. What have I done? Oh, I'm in. All right. Luke 13. There is no Luke 31, you're saying to yourself. And you're exactly right. So here it is. Luke 13 and verse 31. And this is where Jesus weeps over the city from afar. But he winds up by saying here in verse 35, and he's speaking to those Pharisees who more or less ruled in Jerusalem and who had come, I mean, I say more or less, they functionally, de facto, that city was in the palm of their hand. And they came over with the intent of luring him back, and Jesus made this stunning promise. And I'm going back to it because this is where we're headed. And he said, see, your house is left to you desolate. Assuredly, I say to you, you will not see me until the time comes when you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And recall that verse, blessed is he, is a citation from Psalm 118 in verse 26. And Psalm 118 is the psalm of messianic inauguration and the psalm that taught Israel how to receive her Messiah when he did appear. And so what Jesus is saying to those Pharisees, with frankly murder in their hearts, what he is saying is, no, I'm not going to fall for your little trick, and the city is not going to see me until they welcome me as Messiah, until they cry out, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, out of Psalm 118. And as I say, if you'd have been there that day, you'd have said, you know what, that's not going to happen. These men are too powerful and they hate Jesus. That's not going to happen. But it did happen. And what I am exploring here is, what does the Bible teach us about how Jesus made that happen? So that's our focus. But a big part of the story that we talked about last week is in fact the raising of Lazarus. So remember that Jesus remained over there on the eastern side of the Jordan River, in that area called Perea, between the Jordan River and the Arabian Desert. And he continued to teach until the day came when a messenger came to him from Bethany. And he said, the one whom you love, Lazarus, is sick. And you remember that Jesus finally, although his disciples, especially Thomas, insist that we'll probably die there, but they said, let's go die with him. That's how dangerous it was for Jesus to be in the region of Jerusalem. But he did. He came back. And ultimately, of course, he called Lazarus out of that tomb. A remarkable miracle, a miracle which I think was deliberately made more spectacular than it might have been, because Jesus tarried 2 days so that he showed up on the fourth day after Lazarus had died. And the consequence of that is that when that stone was rolled away, the death stench came rolling out of there, which absolutely beyond any question proved that he was in fact dead. And now Jesus calls him, come out of the tomb, and indeed he does emerge from the tomb. And and that miracle cannot be denied. He was genuinely dead. Now, our emphasis was on the ways in which that set the scene for the Passion Week, and specifically for the triumphal entry. And we identified 3 specific ways, and again, they are pointed out specifically by John, 3 ways in which the miracle of Lazarus's resurrection or resuscitation, I'll be more careful, he was called back to mortal life. But there are 3 particulars. I want to rehearse these quickly. Number 1, Jesus became a fugitive. So you have it right there. Excuse me, sometimes this is John chapter 11, and we are told here in John 11 that from that day, the Pharisees plotted to put Jesus to death. And so, number 1, Jesus is a fugitive. As a matter of fact, we read down here, my computer sometimes argues with me, that in verse 57, we're told that they put a price on his head. So, number 1, Jesus is a fugitive. Number 2, because Jesus was wise as a serpent and he knew that the danger was very, very real, he went to a place, a little village called Ephraim. And he is going to stay there until it's time to set out for the Passover. And that's where we're going to pick the story up today. But number 3, and this is so very important, the city of Jerusalem began to swell. That is, people began to arrive in anticipation of the Passover feast, because they needed to come and attend to purification rites. And John simply says here in the brown that as that happened, that the people who came up were looking for Jesus, and they were whispering to themselves. They were saying one to another, what do you think that he'll not come to the feast? So the city is fairly a twitter with the question, is Jesus coming to the feast? Remember that, it's important. So that's as far as we've come. As a matter of fact, now Jesus is tarrying in this little village of Ephraim. So remember that this is the issue before us. I have it here on the screen. That, as we just read there in Luke 13, Jesus had promised that Jerusalem would not see him until they welcomed him as Messiah, till they cried out, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And the question is, how did Jesus make that happen? Again, I want to emphasize, I think important and intriguing to me that Jesus makes a promise which is on the face of it. It's not going to happen. And yet we already have the record that it did happen. And I wonder if we can't find, and I believe we can, how Jesus made that happen. Now, it has to do with geography. And so we're going to do some geography. And it has to do with the route that he took when he went to the Passover. And I'm going to lay this out for you on this map. So follow it if you will. It's probably small on your screen, but let me take you through it. First of all, let's point out Ephraim. The verse at stake, by the way. And might I just say real quickly, this is an exercise in gospel harmonization, because during these last 6 months of Jesus' ministry, both Matthew and Mark drop out of the record, and it's only Luke and John who are tracing the record. And frankly, Luke tells us the story when Jesus is not in Jerusalem, and John picks it up when he is in Jerusalem. Now, it would be interesting to talk another time, as to exactly how this tag team worked, how it developed, but clearly they are tag teaming the story, if you don't mind. But the point is this, that John, in John 11:54, we just saw it, has Jesus in Ephraim. That's where he leaves. And then Luke has Jesus setting out for the Passover. And it's Luke 17:11, and it says, it came to pass as he went to Jerusalem that he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. Now, let me just say that the verse is problematic to many. And I'm going to show you something real quickly. The problem is, and if you go back to we'll go back to this map, that as a matter of fact, let me do this. First of all, Ephraim, I'm just going to situate it on the map. Ephraim, and I've just drawn it in, but it's very close. It's here. It's just north. Here is Jerusalem. Now, it's very small, but it's right here. You can always find Jerusalem by going straight east from the northern tip of the Dead Sea, up in the hill country. But what I want you to see, and I trust you can make it out there, even as small as it is, that Ephraim is north of Jerusalem. No question about it. There are probably 3 different modern cities. Well, there are 2, and then there's one that's been sort of added to the list of late that vie to be Ephraim and so on. But it's clearly just north of Jerusalem, because it's on the frontier or the border between, it's in kind of a deserted area between Samaria to the north and Judea to the south. Now watch on the map. I think you probably know this, but I just want to make dead sure everybody understands. This dynamic. And let me tell you something. Geography is an important element of history, for heaven's sakes. History is a drama that plays out on a stage, and geography is pretty much the stage. And I know just to use the word geography and people's eyes begin to glaze over, but it really is important. And all throughout the Bible, but here in this story, and what I'm going to point out to you here is not just geography, but political governing regions. Rome had divided the entire Mediterranean world up, and there were governing regions. And to the south, you had Judea. To the north was Samaria. Now, and it's so familiar to us because of the statement of the woman at the well in John 4, that the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. It's a fascinating subject, but I'm not going to get into it. Suffice it to say, tracing all the way back to the fact that the Samaritans were brought into existence, more or less, when the northern kingdom was carried off, and the Assyria brought in Gentile peoples and settled the land, and some of the Jews there intermarried with those Gentiles and produced this sort of half-breed, half Jewish, half Gentile, and that was resented. But there were much deeper wounds. Just about 100 years before Christ, a Hasmonean Jewish general, 100 years BC, during that period when the Hasmonean family, or the Maccabees, were controlling Israel, and a very powerful, he didn't start out so powerfully, but he became very powerful, a Hasmonean general by the name of Hyrcanus, had gone up and destroyed Shechem and destroyed the temple, the Samaritan temple on Gerizim and so on. So there was deep, and it had pretty much forced the Samaritans to convert, as it were. So there was deep resentment. And even though Rome, and we are in the Pax Romana, and Rome has done such a tremendous job of wiping out piracy on the land and on the sea, so you could travel and they could move their armies and so on. But there was still local skirmishes and thuggery and so on. So the point is that Judea was just south of Samaria, and they didn't get along. All right, so I'm going to keep going. Judea to the south, Samaria to the north, and then further north, of course, is Galilee. And Galilee is this beautiful, beautiful area. Josephus refers to one plain there, but I think you can almost extrapolate it to the entirety of Lower Galilee, that it is the ambition of nature, and gently rolling hills and much arable, tillable soil and very easy travel and plenty of rain. It's really one of the most lovely spots on earth, and therefore more Jews lived in Galilee than lived in Judea. In Jesus' day, the main Jewish population by far was in Galilee, because life was so much easier there, and once it had been annexed by actually Hyrcanus's successor Aristobulus, but once it had become part of Israel politically and militarily, they controlled it. And this is about 100 years before Jesus, about 103 BC. Tens and hundreds of thousands of Jews who had been living down there in Judea, just in sort of a belt of land right around Jerusalem, they began to move up north. And so again, by the time you get to Jesus' ministry, there are many times more Jews living up in Galilee than there are down in Judea. Now that's going to play into our story. Suffice it to say that a couple of those families that moved from Judea, from Bethlehem specifically, up to Galilee because the living was easier and better, were the families who bore children named Mary and Joseph. So their parents had moved up there. That's why they were living in Nazareth. But I leave it alone. And now, on the other hand, here's what you need to understand. That, and by the way, I'll expand on Galilee. Galilee is that area to the west of the Sea of Galilee. But Galilee is dominated, I say dominated, one of the most important regions of Galilee, and one of the most lovely, is a valley to the south of the southern reaches of the region of Galilee called Jezreel. And the valley is sort of arrowhead shaped. This is what I'm representing here. And it also has a shaft, another valley, and that is called the Herod Valley. And so that valley, the most important valley on the face of the earth, because it is such a choke point, and even in our story today, it's very much a choke point. The traffic coming from Galilee heading down to Jerusalem is going to make its way, first of all, to the Jezreel Valley. All right, with that background, let me just say that there were a couple of ways by which a person might make his way, a traveler, a pilgrim, might make his way from Galilee to Jerusalem. And that's what's at stake. Now, remember this, that is in our story here, we're asking the question, how did Jesus contrive to cause that city to welcome him as king? And what we're telling you here is a very, very important part of it. So stay with me if you will. So I am saying that, and let me say as well, remember that Jesus was Galilean. He lived in Nazareth, and recall that in Luke chapter 2, we're told specifically that his father went up every year. So Jesus knew the habits of the Galilean Jews with regard to getting to Jerusalem for the Passover. Knew it well. All of his life he had made that trip. So Jesus is down here at Ephraim, and he knows. Now, let me just give this much background, that there are two routes, and watch this. There are two routes by which a person might travel from Galilee to Jerusalem for whatever reason, but this is going to be a lot of traffic at Passover time. And first of all, they would come out of their villages, that's what I'm trying to represent, and they would gather in the Jezreel Valley. And again, they might gather as synagogues, as clans, as villages, maybe ad hoc somewhat, but they would come down and they would gather in the Jezreel Valley, because you see, there are two routes by which a person might make his way, or the pilgrims might make their way down to Jerusalem. but they're both dangerous. And so you don't travel these routes alone, especially at Passover time. And so you gather in companies, in bands, in groups. And there might be several scores of people, and the men are kind of on the outside watching out for things. The women and the children tend to be on the inside. They would just make their way slowly down to Jerusalem. By the way, this plays into the story of Jesus being left behind, or actually staying behind in Jerusalem, when his parents went back home when he was, they were there for the Passover and he was 12 years of age. And it says they set out and they both thought him to be in the company. This is the company, the bands of pilgrims making their way, in this case, back up to Galilee. But you don't travel alone. Now, here are the two routes. Number one, there is the ridge route. Now, it's called the ridge route, and in the sense that it follows a series of ridges. This is what's called the Central Ridge Country, the Central Hill Country, and both Samaria to the north and Judea to the south. The hill country is just, it's composed of very, very steep hills with sawtoothed edges that you can't really travel on. So you have to travel on the ridges. And there's a series, and really this is called, as I say, the ridge route, sometimes called the way of the patriarchs, because this is the way the patriarchs travel, because it's always been that way and pretty much still is today, although modern Israel has cut some side roads. But the fact is that when we're in Israel, oftentimes we say we are on the Central Ridge route, we are on the water parting route, we're on the Hebron Road, as it's sometimes called, because it makes its way all the way from the valley of Jezreel, all the way through the hill country of Ephraim, or now in the New Testament Samaria, so down past Shechem and past Shiloh and past Gibeah and past Jerusalem, and all the way down to Hebron, and then to Beersheba, where it falls off into the Negev. So this ridge route is it's the easiest and the most direct. By the way, and I just think this is kind of a handy thing to remember, from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea is pretty much straight on 60 miles. So you can finally kind of gauge how far people are traveling here. But at any rate, it's about 60 miles from on that trip, and it's fairly straight. Now, again, it's not easy, and any of us today, except my friend Jack Owen, would struggle with it. He's quite the hiker, but it's the fastest and by any standard the easiest in that day, and it's the one you would prefer to take. But so that's the ridge route. It goes right down the heart of the country, staying atop the ridges. But look at this. The problem is it passes through Samaria, and Samaria is very dangerous. And so there may have been some seasons where political, military considerations being what they were, it would have been safe. But in most cases, and certainly in this case, at this year, 33 AD, they're not going to take the ridge route. So how are they going to get there? Watch this now. There's another route, and it's called the Rift route, because they do the same thing. They gather in the Jezreel Valley, as I have there, but then rather than heading south through the Dothan Pass, they make their way down the Harod Valley, down the shaft of the arrow, and they ford the Jordan River. There are a number of fords right there near Beit Shan, and they ford the river, and what they're doing is avoiding Samaritan territory. And besides that, travel in the Rift is on the eastern side. Now, let me just say that this right here is part of the Jordan Rift, and it is the deepest fault line on the face of the earth. And much, as a matter of fact, the deepest spot on the American continent is Death Valley, 282 feet is what I understand. But the Sea of Galilee up here, this little pear-shaped sea, is 300 feet below sea level. And the Dead Sea down here, the bean-shaped sea, is about 1,300 feet below sea level. So this is a deep, deep cleft, and it's unspeakably important. It's not an accident. God crafted this world very carefully, and so much of the dynamics of what God is doing and how he uses Israel to do it is quite frankly a function of that rift. But really, you'd rather not go down there, because if you do, you've got to come out, and it's a climb. But the point is that, and I should have said that the rift This is the rift route, and the rift is actually called the Syro-African rift because it stretches all the way from Syria up here in the north, all the way down to Central Africa. So it's a deep, long rift, but the deepest part of it is right here. It's a cleft. It's a tectonic plate cleft in the earth, and so I leave it alone. The point is, there is internal traffic. And by the way, both of the routes that we're talking about here, the ridge route, as I have there, and then the rift route that we're going to follow, both are internal routes. You're not going to have caravans or armies. You can't move that kind of traffic on these routes. This is local village to village routes, but they're very, very passable routes. So now I go back to it. So I'm saying there are two ways by which you might get from Galilee down to Jerusalem. The first is the ridge route, but the second is the rift route. And as I have on the screen, you make your way down the Harod Valley, cross the Jordan River, and now you travel down the eastern side of the Jordan River. There's a road that makes its way all the way down there. Then you reford the river at Jericho, and you make your way up to Jerusalem via the backside of the Mount of Olives, the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. Again, there is three times in the Old Testament that speaks of a mountain which lies on the east of Jerusalem, and it is the Mount of Olives. We talked about it, and you're coming up the back slope, the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. Now, I want to go back. The Bible says that Jesus passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. And you know enough now, just with what we've been through, and much of it I'm sure is already familiar to you, to know that it seems passing strange that on his way to Jerusalem, he passes through the midst of Samaria and then Galilee. Now, it's the more strange if we understand that he's starting out just north of Jerusalem. He's about an hour's walk from Jerusalem on the north side, maybe just a little more. And yet, he heads north and passes through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. And I'll tell you, I'm going to take you to the passage. It's interesting that a lot of versions stumble over this. And so, but let me just say, the Greek could not be more explicit by reason of a clear preposition, by reason of case endings, by reason of a descriptive adjective. This is the way it ought to be translated. He passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee, but it's confusing. Why is he going to Jerusalem, going to Samaria and God? What's that all about? And let me just show you here some of the passages. For instance, the ESV has passing along between Samaria and Galilee. It's not what it says. Now, the New King James does better. He passed through the midst of, because that's pretty much what it says. But the NIV has, he traveled along the border between. The NASB has, and these are all fine translations. I like some better than others, I'll admit. But the point is, I'm not getting after the translation. I just want to see that a lot of people stumble over this, passing between Samaria and Galilee, even the RSV passing along between Samaria and Galilee. The way to translate it is he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. So, how are we going to make sense of this? All right, Jesus is wise as a serpent. He knows it's imperative that he get into the city. He knows that there's a price on his head. He knows that his life is in danger. Now remember this, that again and again, and I think I've talked to you about this before at the beginning of the series, that Jesus used the very self-serving and superficial fascination of the crowds to protect himself. Because everywhere he went, as long as he was surrounded by people who were committed to him, or at least seemed to be committed to him, his enemies knew if we try and seize him, there'll be a riot and our heads will roll. So with that background, let me take you to the passage. The passage is in front of us. So let's imagine that Jesus is in Ephraim. I've marked it there for you. And I think this is what happened. He passed through the midst of Samaria. All right, so he's got to get through Samaria to get to Galilee. Now stop with me here. Folks, you know, in John chapter 4, at the very beginning of his Galilee, he's leaving Judea and he's making his way. It's been about 8 months to a year after his baptism, but he's going to go up to Galilee. And it says in John 4, he needed to go through Samaria. Now, on the way through Samaria, he's going to meet a woman, and he's going to offer to share living water with her. That is, if you drink of the water that I offer you, you'll never, and of course, she is going to become a believer. And then she's going to go into town and announce what this man she has met, and they're going to invite him, and he's going to spend 2 days there. Now, I know this is John 4. This is a long time ago. This is 2 years ago, but that is in our story. But the thing is, I'm working in my head. It's 2.5 years ago. But I know that the popular way to read that is to say, well, Jesus somehow divinely knew that there was a woman at the well, and he wanted to witness to her respectfully, humbly. But again, we talked about this before. I don't think Jesus lived that way. There's nothing in the text to suggest that. I think that everywhere Jesus went, he was careful to share the truth. And he didn't have to go way out of his way just to, no, I think when it says he needed to go through Samaria, it was because he was wise as a serpent and harmless as a dove. And because he had grown up in these parts, in Nazareth, just north of Samaria. And he knew so well the attitudes and the habits of people, and he knew the geography. And he knew, now watch this, that he would be hugely advantaged if he could gain standing in Samaria and thus be able to make his way back and forth through Samaria. And I think he went up and he was looking for the opportunity, and God's providence afforded him that opportunity, and he encountered that woman and shared that blessed news with her. She became a believer and took him into town, and he spends 2 days. Now listen, let me tell you something. This is a clan culture. Samaria is and was, the Samaritans today, it's a very small number today, but they're remarkably clannish, and they were in that day. And so this would impact the entire clan. I have a friend, I tell this story often, I have a friend in Jericho. Now, I have a dear friend who's a ministry partner in Jericho, but his dad owns a restaurant, not a believer, but a blessed man, quite old. And when we stop and have lunch there at the Green Valley restaurant in Jericho, absolutely delightful. If you go to Jericho, for heaven's sakes, go to the Green Valley and ask them to tell you about the marvelous ministry they have, outreach there. But the point is that I got to talking to the older gentleman one time, and just a few months ago actually, and he told me just in passing that he was thinking about going and spending some time in Houston. And I said, "Oh, do you have people in Houston?" And he said, "Oh yeah. Some years ago, a number of families started to move there, and so I have a good number of I have a lot of people in Houston." And it was interesting. I was interested, and so I, well, about how many? And he said, "Well, I think it's about 12,000." So he was aware of a clan of 12,000 who are now living in Houston, and it's a clan. They stay in. Now, my point is, take that back to Sychar, and Jesus stays 2 days in that village, and they beg him to stay longer. And my point is simply this, that Jesus was able to gain standing. He was acceptable. And therefore, on several occasions, again, about 3 times in the text, he is going to advantage himself. Let me just mention one in John chapter 7. Matter of fact, probably wouldn't hurt to go there. I can go there quickly. In John chapter 7, it's the Feast of Tabernacles. And you'll remember that this is 6 months before Jesus dies. And you'll remember that his brothers made fun of him. They didn't believe in him and so on. And they said, "Aren't you going?" And he said, "Well, I'm not going now. You go ahead." And then he goes, and then it says this, when his brothers had gone up to the feast, here it is right here, verse 10. When his brothers had gone up to the feast, he went not openly, but as it were in secret. Now, as it were in secret. Now, how did he do it in secret? Well, interestingly enough, we don't have to wonder, because we can go to a parallel passage. There are a lot of parallels between John and the Synoptics, but there is one here. And it's in Luke chapter 9, which describes the same event where Jesus sets out for Jerusalem. And this is Luke 9 and verse 51. And I'm convinced it's exactly parallel. But again, it says it came to pass when the time had come for, all right, this is the beginning of the last 6 months of Jesus' life, and he's moving toward it. But what I want you to see, he's going to go to Jerusalem. And so he sent messengers to prepare for him. And interestingly, they didn't receive him. This is at the Feast of Tabernacles last September. All right. We're at Passover now. But just a bit of a flashback to make a point that it's explicit. And it's so interesting that it says that he sent messengers. All right. This is the way Jesus was a rabbi, and he had disciples, and disciples would travel with him. Now he's got apostles, but those apostles, part of what they do is just this: they run ahead and make preparation, and they find food and so on. That's what the rabbi does. His helpers, his disciples are his helpers, and they're his attendants. So Jesus sends a couple of the apostles ahead, and one of the villages says nothing doing, because his face was set for the journey to Jerusalem. Now this makes the point that I was making earlier, that it was dangerous to go through Samaria, but especially at feast seasons, because the Samaritans loved to make life hard for the Jews, and so they wouldn't let them pass, and they would fall upon them and rob and so on. And so, but now Jesus has standing. But even so, it's interesting that his disciples run ahead, and he come back and they say, well, that one won't take. Of course, John wants to call down fire, and he says, shame on you. But look at this. It says they went to another village. So think about what's at stake here. This is not the only time, but in John, it says it was tabernacles, and he went, but he didn't go openly. He went secretly, but he didn't put on a disguise. He went through Samaria. And because he was traveling through Samaria, he could be sure that the Jewish authorities were not going to give him any trouble. They're not coming near that place. So I'm saying, I'm going back to it, that Jesus was wise as a serpent. And early on, he had contrived to provide, he had provided himself with a route from Galilee to Judea, where he, when it was dangerous, he could make that route and be safe. And that's exactly what he does. So I'm going to say it again. Here is Jesus, here is Jesus at, here's Jesus at Ephraim. Now he's just on the border with Samaria. And he's relatively safe there because it's close enough to Samaria that the Jews aren't coming around. But now he sets out, and as the text says, he passes through, first of all, the midst of Samaria. So there he goes, and it's safe, and he comes up, and once he gets into the valley of Jezreel, he's in the midst of Galilee. And what clearly happens is Jesus falls in with one of those bands of Passover pilgrims. And he makes his way, now watch on the screen, down the Harod Valley, down the eastern side of the Jordan River, fords the Jordan River, and then makes his way up the ascent of Adumim, the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives, all the way from the Dead Sea, 1,300 feet below sea level, to atop the Mount of Olives, which is 2,700 feet above sea level, a 4,000-foot climb, and about 15 miles. It's a rigorous climb. And by the way, the Jewish pilgrims would much rather have taken the ridge route, but it was dangerous. And this route was about half again as long, about 90 miles. But all that to say, we're asking the question: how did Jesus contrive to get away? How did he cause the city to welcome him as king? And I think this is the answer, and it's right in the Bible. That is, his route is explicit. So he makes his way up and joins in up here. Once he gets up into Galilee, he joins in with one of those bands of Passover pilgrims. And interestingly enough, Matthew and Mark, who have been silent for 6 months in the record, join the record here. And as Jesus makes his way, we have him interacting with scores of people. We have him teaching. This is when he challenges the Pharisee, teaching about divorce. We have him instructing his disciples along the way about how to handle church problems and so on in Matthew 18. He's healing people. He heals 10 lepers and only one returns. When he gets to Jericho, he heals Bartimaeus and his friends. Jesus is being very, very much the provocateur. He's very much the center of attention. He's doing miracles. He's teaching publicly. At Jericho, he invites himself to lunch with a tax collector. Now, when Jesus looked and saw that diminutive man in the tree and said, Zacchaeus, come down, I want to come to your house for lunch, there would have been a gasp that went up. What? He's going to go eat with a tax collector? But Jesus is, which is not Levitically wrong, but it's frowned upon by the culture. And so Jesus is being so much the provocateur. And you know what? If I'd have been in the next pilgrim band behind, if I'd have been in the group behind, and I heard that the Nazarene was up there doing miracles and so on, I'd have hooked it and caught up with them. And so I think the group is getting bigger and bigger. But watch this, got to be done. So now they make their way all the way to Jerusalem, and it's about, listen, it's about 90 miles. It's 90 difficult miles, those last 15, but the average distance you could walk in a day, they always say, is about 25 miles. But if you're a big group and you're not hurrying, it's about 20 miles. So we've got at least 5 or 6 days. And so Jesus has been with these people, all the excitement, listening, hanging on every word, so excited for 6 days. About. But then John picks the story up. And in John 12, I have it here on the screen, we read that 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany. Now you need to understand, we've talked about this before with the raising of Lazarus, that Bethany is just to the east of Jerusalem. So here you are coming up the steep slope, and just before you crest the Mount of Olives, coming from the east. And once you crest the Mount of Olives, you're going to dip down, you're going to see the temple, Herod's temple, right in front of you, the Kidron Valley. But just before you crest the Mount of Olives, there's a road that goes off to the south, and it takes you to Bethany. So, back to my point. How is it that Jesus contrived to alert the city to his coming? Well, I think this is the answer. In John 12 and verse 6, I read it to you just now, we read that right here, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany in the yellow. Now, I'm going to talk next time about what happens there in Bethany, but what I want you to see is this, and this is where we're going to conclude. And on Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock, I intend to go live on Facebook, if I can get that working. I think I will. And we will talk about the triumphal entry. But I want you to see, this is the answer to the question. So as a matter of fact, I'm going to go back to the question that I set before you. And that question is, I'm rewinding here, how Jesus had promised that Jerusalem would not see him. That's Luke 13. That's where we started. How did Jesus make that happen? And I'm going to say one more time, Jesus was wise as a serpent. He was a Galilean. He knew the habits of the Jews well, the Jews from Galilee who were going to make their way down to Jerusalem for the feast. And so what Jesus does is, I am persuaded, I don't have to be persuaded, it's there in the text. Jesus hides at a place called Ephraim. When it's time, and he knows how much time he needs, he makes his way north, and he falls in with one of those bands of Passover pilgrims. Now he begins to teach and to do miracles, and as I say, just excite a lot of attention and so on. And for 5 or 6 days, they make their way all the way down. But 6 days before the Passover, Jesus comes to Bethany. 6 days before the Passover is Friday. The Passover was on Thursday that year. So 6 days before the Passover is Friday. What happens when the sun goes down on Friday? Well, Shabbat begins. Now hear me. You're traveling with Jesus. Maybe it's the first time you've ever visited Jerusalem, but you're so excited and you've come with him and you think we're all headed for Jerusalem. But just before we get to the top of the hill, we're making our last climb up the hill. We all watch. Jesus is every bit the center of attention. And we watch as he kind of waves to us and he takes the 12 and he goes down that little path And we know exactly where he's going. We know it's Friday. We know that we've got to make ready for the Sabbath. And we know that he raised Lazarus from the dead just weeks ago. He's going down to keep the Sabbath, the Shabbat, with Lazarus. But I don't want to go to Bethany. None of these people do. So we go into the city of Jerusalem. And as we do, remember, what is everybody in the city asking one another? The whole city is abuzz, John said, with the question, what do you think? Will Jesus even come to the feast? And I like to say, you get your Warholian 15 minutes. If you get for 15 minutes, everybody wants to talk to you because you have two messages. Now get this. You have two messages. Number one, in answer to the question everybody's asking, yes, he's coming. I know he's coming. My goodness. I've been traveling with him. He's been doing miracles. He is coming to the feast. Isn't this exciting? But you have a second message. Watch this. He'll be here Sunday morning. Why? Because he stopped at Bethany. There is a deliberate zone around a walled city called the Sabbath zone. Because by rabbinical law, but it was pretty well acknowledged, you couldn't travel more than a Sabbath day's journey. And I've seen various estimates. Let's say it's about 1 2/5 miles. Now it's not linear. It's not that you can only walk, 1 2/5 miles, and then you got to sit down and wait for the sun to go down. It's a zone. And wherever you are, as the sun goes down on Friday evening, you draw a 1 2/5 miles radius circle around you, and you can move freely inside that zone, but you can't leave the zone. Well, the rabbis were careful about this, and so they would go to the center of a walled city, and they would march out 1 2/5 miles, the Sabbath days, and they'd put a marker on the road. So if you'd never been to Jerusalem before, once you see Jesus wave you goodbye and then walk further over the crest of the hill, you see that Sabbath marker, and you know that Bethany is outside the Sabbath zone. So you know he's not coming in tonight, and he won't come in until Sunday morning. So Jesus contrives, by reason of a very clever route, to alert the city. Now, let me make one more point here. Let me take you back to the scriptures. And in John 12, he does, well, I just want to take you down to to verse 12, because here is John's telling of the triumphal entry. But what I want you to see is that he says, the next day, a great multitude that had come to the feast, when they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. And a lot of the commentators and they say, we don't know how he heard. No, we know how they heard. Jesus was wise as the serpent, and he had made a promise. And so now think about what happens, folks. And this is for Sunday afternoon when we meet once again, and we'll go back over it just a little bit. But think about what's at stake. Jesus is so clever that he lays a plan, and he takes a trip all the way around up to Galilee, down to the Rift, back up, and so on, teaching, doing miracles. Now, he sends all of these hundreds and hundreds of people into this city. This city that is wondering if Jesus is coming, and they're bearing the message. He is coming, and he'll be here. Now, I'm surmising this, but that's what I would have been saying, and they could have known it because it's so specific. It was 6 days before the Passover that Jesus went to Bethany, and they went on into the city. Now, think about what's happening here, folks. It's Passover. The city is swollen to 10 or more times its normal size. Because it's Passover, every Jewish mind is fixed on God's promise to deliver them from a Gentile overlord. That's what Passover celebrates. It celebrates when God delivered them from Egypt in fulfillment of a specific promise given to Abraham in Genesis 15. Well, guess what? There's a new Gentile overlord. It's called Rome. And this generation has a promise. It's called Daniel's 70 weeks. The prophecy there in Daniel 9. They've got a 483-year alarm clock that's been ticking for most of 483 years, and they know it has to go off pretty soon. So my point is, it's Passover. The city is swollen to several times its size. We're all sick up to here with Rome. We're tired of her. And probably very few people, or at least the people from the land there aren't very many people who don't have at least, a a neighbor who has a friend, or a cousin who has a next door neighbor who's been healed by this wonder working Nazarene. So you're saying to yourself, you know what? Again, you're there for Passover. You're living in one of those tents all around the city, or you've crammed yourself into one of the homes that are opened up to everybody who's coming, and the word begins to spread through the city. The Nazarene is coming. He stopped in Bethany. Well, he'll be here Sunday morning, and there's only one road from Bethany. And so you're saying to yourself, I know my rabbi says the man is an imposter. He insists that all those miracles are just done by the power of Beelzebub, but I don't think so. I got friends. And for heaven's sakes, there's a guy named Lazarus who's walking around who was dead for 4 days. I know I'm not supposed to believe in this guy as the Messiah, but man, am I sick of Rome. And if I have to go to battle against Rome, I wouldn't mind following somebody who could raise me from the dead. And so I think without any orchestration, without any concert, without any Facebook alerts, obviously, just the word begins to spread. He'll be here Sunday morning. And those people do what you and I would do. They said, well, I'm going to get up early and see. And so now Jesus rides into the city, and the city erupts in happy welcome. If you'd have been there in Luke 13 in Perea, when Jesus made that promise, you'd have said, not going to happen. It happened. And it wasn't, I've seen again and again, maybe, I don't know, several times, this represented as Jesus riding into the city, and this people, and he's saying, oh, who saw that? Oh, this is nice. No. Jesus made this happen. He didn't make it happen by interrupting everybody's will and somehow imposing some sort of robotic, make everybody a robot and so on. He made it happen by alerting the city to his coming. And in so doing, he so excited the city that when he did ride in on Sunday morning, they cried out, and we'll see this on Sunday, but it's explicit in the text, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Folks, Jesus was wise as a serpent and harmless as a dove. Now, we will, as I say, pick the story up right there on Sunday afternoon, 4 o'clock, and we'll talk about the triumphal entry itself and the passages that are involved. But just understand that I believe biblically, you harmonize the scriptures, and you be honest with the fact that it says he passed through the midst of Samaria. He's going north. And you ask yourself, why would he do that? And then you just trace the narrative as he makes his way down, and all three synoptics are telling the story now. And you see that according to John, it was just 6 days, Friday, before the Passover that he arrived. And then you read where John 12 says, when they heard that Jesus was coming, they went out to welcome him. And I think we can answer the question, how did Jesus make that happen? All right, we'll pick the story up there on Sunday and then follow it through the week.